The Acolyte is the newest Star Wars show, and everyone hates it. Or they used to hate it, but some still do. Look, it's complicated. The Acolyte is the most recent Star Wars show to be shrouded with discourse. I try my best on this channel to be analytical and not talk about necessarily my opinions about shows, but rather how art affects us. But there's no such thing as objective art, so it's hard to look at the show completely objectively. But I want to mainly talk today about the response to The Acolyte, the discourse that surrounded the show rather than the quality of the show itself, and look at how toxic modern fandom can sometimes judge a show before it even finishes coming out. Now, this is not a problem exclusively with Star Wars. A lot of franchise media nowadays releases with this sense of backlash where a very small but very loud portion of a fandom takes up a lot of the noise around a show's reception, as they approach a new piece of media with entitlement and negativity. Now, The Acolyte was no different. The show had a couple of things going against it, which fans used as ammunition against the show's reception. There are pockets of the Star Wars fandom that don't like specific things, but to generalize the entire fandom, which as you'll see in the video is a bad thing to do, there are three main things that can help push a new piece of Star Wars media towards this negative reception. And those three things are: number one, a lack of recognizable known characters from the Star Wars franchise; number two, a setting unfamiliar to most Star Wars fans; and number three, the appearance of women and people of color. Now, a lot of you might think that last point is a bit ridiculous, and I would agree. This specific part of the fandom is a very small and very toxic area, but it definitely exists, and I think it would be irresponsible not to mention it in a video about Star Wars fandom. But it is important to remember that there is tiers to this criticism. Not liking The Acolyte does not mean that you subscribe to one or two or any of these three reasons, really. Not every criticism of The Acolyte should be lumped together, but it can become very dangerous as people with normal criticisms of the show start to adopt the rhetoric of this far more toxic viewpoint. This is certainly not a problem exclusive to Star Wars. You see it currently also happening with The Boys. It happened with The Last of Us Part 2. And if you want to see more analysis on the way in which fandoms and franchise media intersect, then subscribe to the channel. That's kind of primarily what I talk about here. But I wanted to focus specifically on The Acolyte today, because I think it is a prime example of fans' toxic discourse and actual criticism, and how those two can become very deeply intertwined. And once those two things connect, how people's expectations about what Star Wars is, based on unfounded reasoning, can lead to disappointment in new media. Now, if it wasn't already clear within my tone of this video, I actually quite enjoyed The Acolyte. So if you're also sitting there thinking, why does everyone hate the show? I thought it was pretty good. I'm on your side, I guess, in this, but understand my bias going into this video. I enjoyed the show, and I hope today to show you some of the reasons why I think the show is actually quite good. It's certainly not the best piece of Star Wars media, and I have my problems with the show, but I think it's better than most of the Star Wars content releasing today, other than like the couple of the first seasons of The Mandalorian and Andor. I don't subscribe to either camps of people who don't like it for invalid reasons and people who don't like it for valid reasons. I have my own reasons for liking the show, and I hope that you're open-minded enough to see those reasons and see just how varied the opinions on Star Wars can be. Huh, is that a segue? Part 1. Star Wars fans are all different. The Star Wars fandom is so varied that there does not exist one single type of Star Wars fan. Star Wars as a fandom has been around for decades. It started in the 70s, and the fact that this franchise is still as popular as it is today goes to show you the quality of the content made around Star Wars fandoms. However, a multi-generational franchise like this leads to generational fandoms, which is one of the big problems of the response to new Star Wars shows. Because of how long Star Wars has been out for and the variety of content that releases for it, the Star Wars fandom shifts every 10 to 15 years as more people find new entry points into this franchise. Depending on when your entry point to Star Wars was, changes your expectations about what you expect from Star Wars media. If you're a die-hard fan who saw the original trilogy in cinemas, your expectations of what Star Wars is very different from the 12-year-old who started watching The Mandalorian because they thought Baby Yoda looked cute. That kid's version of Star Wars is The Mandalorian. It's Grogu. It's not Luke and Leia. Me, I grew up in the 2000s. My version of Star Wars is the prequels. It's the Clone Wars. It's Anakin and Obi-Wan. That's the Star Wars that I respond to. It's cool lightsaber combat. It's cringy dialogue. It's bureaucratic trade disputes. But there are other entry points into Star Wars. Maybe you played Jedi Fallen Order, and that was your introduction to the franchise. Or maybe you played Star Wars The Old Republic in the 2000s, and what you think of as Star Wars is something that has not been touched in any other media since. Maybe you read a lot of the expanded universe content that came out after the original trilogy, or maybe you're a comic book fan. There are so many different types of Star Wars fans, so to claim there is only one type of Star Wars minimizes the variety of content that exists within this franchise. There is no core as to what Star Wars is. It's one of the things that makes this franchise so fresh. People want to see the things from Star Wars that brought them into this franchise in the first place, and I don't think anyone who has that opinion is invalid. People who are expecting to see the original trilogy again are not wrong in their disappointment. People who want to see more of the prequels and are upset by the way Obi-Wan Kenobi turned out are not invalid for their opinion. However, their opinion is not the only opinion of Star Wars fans. There was this really interesting Forbes article that was written during the release of The Acolyte by Eric Kane, which spoke about how The Acolyte disregards everything that makes Star Wars good. And I couldn't help but fundamentally disagree with him. I don't think his opinion is invalid. What he remembers about Star Wars is what he wants to see more of. But what he expects from new Star Wars media and wants to see from Star Wars content is completely different to mine. That's kind of the point of these franchises now. You do not need to engage and love every single new piece of media in this franchise, but there are parts of the fandoms that will respond to different parts of the media in different ways. A small section of the response to The Acolyte came into this idea that the Jedi are acting erratically, weirdly, different to how we're used to seeing them. If your expectation of what the Jedi are comes from the original trilogy where they are revered and loved, then of course this version of The Acolyte is different from that. The prequel knowledge that I have from the Jedi are that they are arrogant, they are fallible. The fact that Yoda goes into exile because he stuffs up so badly makes Torben's meditation look tame in comparison. The Acolyte fits a lot more into the prequel and Old Republic understanding of the Jedi. This is a show designed for fans of the prequels. This is a show designed for fans of the Old Republic. This is a show for fans who want to see the nuances of Star Wars, more than just light side, bad side, and wants to instead see the balance of the Force. Now, that being said, I don't think that The Acolyte fully nails this point, but it does enough in an interesting way that kept me engaged for most of the season. Now, if you've made it this far into the video, I have a small favor to ask of you. If you would like to make a comment on this video, good or bad, about The Acolyte, I don't mind. Please just end your comment with the phrase, "May the Force be with you." That way, all of us know the people who are actually interested in the comments about having an actual conversation and have watched the video, and the people who just commented and have not actually watched the video at all. Just a little secret between you and me. Anyway, back to the main video. Part 2, expectations lead to hate. Hate leads to suffering. Part of the Star Wars fandom is the knowledge and love for characters that we have seen pop up time and time again in the various films and TV shows that have released within Star Wars. And we have been spoiled by these cameos in the recent Disney Plus shows. There was a lot of speculation about the appearance of Master Yoda and Darth Plagueis within The Acolyte. Technically speaking, Yoda has appeared in other High Republic comics, so his appearance wouldn't be so crazy, and Darth Plagueis has not been canonized, but technically would have been around kicking during this time in the canon anyway. If your enjoyment of The Acolyte relied on the appearance of these characters, then I don't think you probably would have given the show a proper chance. Sure, at the end of the season you are vindicated with the appearance of both of these characters, but their appearance in the finale is fanservice at best and doesn't really change the plot of the rest of the show, but instead teases the implications on the future of the series. But by setting yourself up for this expectation, you fall into the trap of a lot of modern toxic fandom. Expectation is one of the biggest issues with how a lot of new Star Wars media is received. People expect a certain thing of Star Wars, and if it doesn't fit into that very narrow expectation, then the show is branded as terrible before it's even given a chance. This expectation is based upon what I was speaking with earlier, every individual fan's expectations about what Star Wars is. But like I said, those expectations vary from person to person. To outcry that this show does not fit into your specific expectations about what Star Wars is, limits the potential of the franchise's storytelling. The inconsistent actions of the Jedi are not consistent with the prequel's depiction of the Jedi, but that being said, The Acolyte takes place 100 years before the prequel films. If you looked at humans' behavior 100 years ago, you could very easily take that out of context and say, what? Why aren't they acting like the way people act now? That's weird. The Jedi and the Acolyte operate in a very similar way. Obviously, something has happened to the Jedi that have changed the way in which the Order has run between the events of the Acolyte and the prequel trilogy. That's not a plot hole. That's a plot device. If you expected the Acolyte's betrayal of the Jedi or certain characters to be consistent with the way in which you expected them to be, then you're setting yourself up for failure. A lot of the discourse and noise around the Acolyte shifted after the release of episode 5, where many of the main characters were brutally murdered by the Stranger, and it was awesome. What a sick episode of TV. This episode is considered the turning point of the show, where a lot of the major mysteries start to become unveiled as we start to see the implications of what those mysteries mean for the wider story. The Acolyte treats its audience with respect. The week before, most of us had figured out the identity of the Stranger, but the show isn't going to relish in this mystery and encourage you to start picking up the dots. There is no reveal as to who the Stranger's master is, but keen viewers will be able to put it together. You do not need the show to write it out for you if you're able to figure it out already. The Acolyte treats its audience with intelligence and respect, and hinges its mysteries on the audience's ability to pay attention to what is happening during the show. Thomas Bacon's article on Screenland proposes that this episode specifically debunks a lot of the criticism that the Acolyte was getting in its first couple of episodes, and shows how the fandom had written off the show before giving it time to develop. By writing off anything based on your expectations of what it will be prevents a show from being able to win you over. Watching the show then becomes a form of confirmation bias, asking the show to convince you why your opinion of it is already wrong. If you went into the Acolyte wanting it to be bad, there are many things you can point to in the show that justify your opinion. However, what you end up doing is rejecting the parts of the show that perhaps maybe challenge that view. But that works both ways. If you went into the Acolyte expecting it to be the greatest piece of Star Wars media ever, there are definitely aspects that you can point to corroborate that. I don't agree with either of these opinions. I don't think the Acolyte is the greatest piece of Star Wars media, nor do I think it's the worst. I think a problem with a lot of discourse nowadays is that for a show to exist, it has to be within these two camps for it to be considered anything at all. There is no more room for the mid. But if you want to know more specifically about what happened to the mid, I have a full video talking about how this extreme view online about good and bad has left a gap for mid content. So go watch that if you're interested. But honestly, if you didn't expect cringy dialogue and chanting witches to exist within the same universe as Dexter Jetster and his 50s diner, or Cy Snoodles, then I wonder what elements of Star Wars you pick and choose to base your expectations upon. Nothing since The Return of the Jedi has ever really even been like the original trilogy again, and George Lucas went back and retroactively made sure of that, to kind of redefine what Star Wars is. Expectations about what the Acolyte would be led people to disappointment. But maybe this idea, this expectation of what Star Wars is, never existed at all. Part 3, Canon, I hardly know him. Some of the more toxic discourse around the Acolyte was the way in which the show disregarded canon. This is a big thing in franchise media in general, the way in which a show fits into the wider context of a franchise, and as such a wide and historic franchise as Star Wars is, there is so much canon content that needs to be considered when making new material. But sometimes I think the outcry of canon can sometimes be overblown. Ki-Adi-Mundi went from a character that everyone thought was a meme to suddenly the most important character in all of Star Wars canon because his birth year was changed. I would encourage any Star Wars fan who is really caught up in the canon to consistently string together any two Star Wars movies in a way that makes sense. There's canon inconsistencies in the original trilogy. Somehow, I always knew. Why'd you kiss her, bro? This connects back to this idea of this false expectation about what Star Wars is. Star Wars has never been consistent with its canon. It's never tried to be. Disney's removal of the Legends material, while being a terrible move, does not necessarily change the way in which Star Wars media was running beforehand. The Star Wars Legends stuff was not consistent, really. The best parts of Star Wars is the way in which it can tell these stories without its fear of being inconsistent. It's a tale of light and dark, of Jedi and the Force. That comes with inconsistency. Star Wars is a mythic tale of legend. It's not a historical document. At the end of the day, creating fresh, new experiences is what's made the Star Wars franchise so profitable for so long. Without the fresh thinking of new Star Wars content, it wouldn't have been able to innovate consistently for 50 years. Star Wars has and always will exist within the memories of those who engage with it. When a franchise has as much content as Star Wars has, demanding that new stories fit within the context of that wider world restricts those stories creatively. A lot of what I really enjoyed about The Acolyte was its balance between recognizable Star Wars content and new characters, new settings, new stories. That's what makes Star Wars so inviting. Both The Mandalorian and Andor, two of the best received Star Wars media in the past decade, specifically disregard everything that makes Star Wars Star Wars. The Mandalorian takes the setting of Star Wars and makes a Western, and Andor takes Rogue One and makes it even more singularly focused. The Acolyte is created to fill this gap, to create a Star Wars show that is unabashedly Star Wars. Leslie Headland, the creator of The Acolyte, cares deeply about canon, cares deeply about the Old Republic and the prequels, and it shows in the content that the show focuses on. These epic lightsaber battles, this depiction of the Jedi. This is the most Star Wars we have gotten in a very long time. The Acolyte is clearly made by someone who cares about Star Wars. And just because that Star Wars may not be what you care about does not make it invalid. But the truth is, sometimes the things we love change. Sometimes the things that captured us as children don't capture us anymore. Sometimes we have to watch the next generation be captivated by a franchise we can no longer engage with. Star Wars has been that way for so many people, for so many years. It redefined science fiction in the 70s, it forever changed cinematic technology in the 2000s, and fundamentally changed the way in which television operated in the 2010s. Your Star Wars may be different to my Star Wars, but all we can hope is that these stories continue to grasp the imaginations of everyone for many generations to come. Ooh, I'm a Force Ghost, telling you to like and subscribe to my channel for more analytical content. Ooh. Isn't it glad that I didn't come back as a different version of myself that you didn't recognize? That would be dumb.